At 8:15 in the morning on August 6th, 1945, a city of roughly 350,000 people was going about an entirely ordinary Monday. Streetcars moved through downtown streets. Office workers settled into their desks. Schoolchildren stood in formation for morning assembly. And then, in less time than it takes to read this sentence, a flash brighter than the sun appeared in the sky above them. And within seconds, tens of thousands of those people were dead, an entire city center reduced to rubble and fire, and a war that had already claimed the lives of an estimated 70 million people worldwide was, for all practical purposes, over. One bomb, one aircraft, one 9-second fall from an altitude of 31,000 feet, and a level of destruction that, until that single morning, no human being on Earth had ever witnessed or even fully imagined possible. That is the staggering, almost incomprehensible scale this story operates on, and it should stop you cold, because what makes it even more unsettling is this. The physics that made that single bomb possible had been sitting quietly inside the structure of ordinary matter since the beginning of the universe, hidden in plain sight inside every atom of every substance on Earth, waiting for human beings to figure out how to unlock it. It took barely 4 decades from the moment scientists first seriously proposed that atoms even contained a nucleus, to the moment that nucleus was split open and weaponized into a device capable of erasing a city in an instant. To understand how humanity traveled that distance, from pure scientific curiosity about the smallest building blocks of matter to a weapon that ended the deadliest war in human history in the span of a single flash, you have to go back nearly 25 centuries to a philosophical argument in ancient Greece about whether matter could be divided forever, or whether, eventually, you would hit something that could not be broken down any further. Around the 5th century before the Common Era, Greek philosophers Leucippus and his student Democritus proposed an idea that, at the time, was pure abstract reasoning with no experimental basis whatsoever. The notion that if you kept cutting a piece of matter in half again and again, you would eventually arrive at a particle so small it could not be divided any further, a fundamental, indivisible unit they called atomos, Greek for uncuttable. For roughly 2,000 years afterward, this idea remained almost entirely philosophical, discussed and debated but never tested, since no instrument existed anywhere in the ancient or medieval world capable of examining matter at any scale remotely close to what Democritus had imagined. It took until the early 19th century for the idea to re-enter serious scientific consideration, when the English chemist John Dalton, working from careful experimental observations about how elements combined in fixed proportions to form compounds, revived and formalized atomic theory in 1803, proposing that each chemical element was made up of atoms of a distinct, characteristic weight, a genuinely testable scientific claim that launched modern chemistry as a rigorous quantitative science. For most of the 19th century, scientists treated the atom essentially the way Democritus had, as a solid, indivisible unit, the final stopping point of matter. That assumption began collapsing in 1897, when British physicist J.J. Thomson, experimenting with cathode ray tubes at Cambridge University, discovered the electron, a particle far smaller and lighter than any atom, carrying a negative electrical charge, definitively proving that atoms were not indivisible after all, but were themselves built from smaller components. Just a year earlier, in 1896, French physicist Henri Becquerel had stumbled onto an entirely different and, in hindsight, even more consequential discovery, observing that uranium salts spontaneously emitted a mysterious form of energy capable of fogging photographic plates even in complete darkness, a phenomenon that would soon be named radioactivity. Polish-born physicist Marie Curie, working alongside her husband Pierre in a converted shed in Paris under conditions that would horrify any modern safety regulator, spent years painstakingly isolating and studying radioactive elements, discovering polonium and radium, and establishing radioactivity as a genuine field of physics. Work that would eventually cost Marie Curie her own life, as decades of unshielded exposure to radioactive material caused the illness that killed her in 1934, a grim, early warning about the power the scientific community was only just beginning to understand it had stumbled into. The atom's internal structure came into far sharper focus in 1911, when New Zealand-born physicist Ernest Rutherford, working at the University of Manchester, directed a famous experiment in which researchers fired charged particles at a thin sheet of gold foil, expecting the particles to pass through with only minor deflection, given the prevailing assumption that atoms were something like a diffuse, evenly distributed cloud of matter. Instead, a small number of particles bounced back almost directly toward the source, a result so shocking that Rutherford later compared it to firing an artillery shell at a piece of tissue paper and having it bounce back and hit you. That result could only mean one thing. Atoms were mostly empty space, with nearly all of their mass concentrated into an incredibly small, dense core at the center, a structure Rutherford named the nucleus. Just a few years earlier, in 1905, a young patent clerk in Switzerland named Albert Einstein had published his theory of special relativity, which contained within it perhaps the most consequential single equation in the history of physics, E equals mc squared, a formula establishing that mass and energy were, at the deepest level, the same thing, interchangeable, and that even a tiny amount of mass, converted fully into energy, would release an amount of power almost impossible to intuitively grasp. Nobody in 1905 understood that Einstein had just written down the theoretical foundation for a weapon capable of leveling cities. And for the next 3 decades, this remained a purely academic curiosity, filed away in the growing body of theoretical physics that scientists across Europe were building, largely for the sake of understanding the universe rather than weaponizing it. That purely scientific, largely apolitical era of nuclear physics ended abruptly in 1938 in a laboratory in Berlin, in a country that had, by that point, already fallen under the control of the Nazi regime. German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, conducting experiments bombarding uranium atoms with neutrons, observed a genuinely baffling result, finding traces of barium, an element roughly half the atomic weight of uranium, appearing in their samples, a result that made no sense according to the physics understood at the time. Hahn wrote urgently to a former colleague, the Austrian physicist Lise Meitner, a brilliant nuclear physicist who had, just months earlier, been forced to flee Germany entirely because she was Jewish, escaping to Sweden with barely more than the clothes she was wearing, as Nazi racial laws made it impossible for her to continue her scientific career or remain safe at all inside the country where she had spent decades building it. Meitner, working through the physics during a walk in the snow with her nephew, the physicist Otto Frisch, realized what Hahn's laboratory had actually witnessed without fully understanding it. The uranium nucleus had split apart, a process Meitner and Frisch named nuclear fission, releasing an enormous burst of energy in the process. Exactly the kind of mass-to-energy conversion Einstein's equation had predicted more than 3 decades earlier. It is a genuinely bitter historical detail that the discovery which explained how to unlock this energy came not from the German scientists who had performed the experiment inside Nazi Germany, but from a Jewish woman that same regime had just driven into exile, a scientist whose crucial theoretical contribution would, for decades afterward, receive far less public credit and recognition than it deserved. News of nuclear fission spread through the international physics community within weeks, and almost immediately, physicists on every side of the emerging conflict understood the terrifying implication buried inside this discovery. If splitting a single uranium nucleus released energy, and if that reaction could be made to sustain itself, one splitting atom triggering the splitting of others in a rapidly multiplying chain reaction, the theoretical energy released from a sufficient quantity of uranium would dwarf anything achievable through conventional chemical explosives, potentially by a factor of millions. Physicists who had spent their careers pursuing pure scientific understanding suddenly found themselves confronting the possibility that their field of study had just produced the blueprint for the most destructive weapon ever conceived, and that Nazi Germany, home to some of the finest nuclear physicists in the world, might already be working to build one. That fear, more than any single laboratory result, is what set the atomic bomb's construction into motion. In August 1939, Leo Szilard, a Hungarian-born physicist who had fled Europe and understood better than almost anyone the real danger a fascist regime with nuclear weapons capability might pose, drafted a letter warning of exactly this possibility and persuaded Albert Einstein, whose scientific reputation carried enormous public weight, to sign it and send it directly to President Franklin Roosevelt. The Einstein-Szilard letter warned that recent nuclear research made it conceivable that extremely powerful bombs could be constructed, and that Germany might already be pursuing exactly this path, urging the American government to accelerate its own research and secure a reliable supply of uranium before it was too late. Roosevelt, initially cautious, eventually authorized a research effort that grew, over the following 3 years, from a small advisory committee into what would become the largest, most secretive, and most expensive scientific and industrial undertaking in human history up to that point, formally organized in 1942 under the name the Manhattan Project. The scale of what the United States built to pursue this weapon is difficult to overstate. Under the military direction of General Leslie Groves and the scientific leadership of physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project ultimately employed well over 100,000 people across dozens of secret sites scattered throughout the country, most working without any real understanding of what the larger project was actually building, compartmentalized so thoroughly that entire towns sprang up around massive industrial facilities whose workers had no idea they were helping construct the raw material for the most powerful weapon ever built. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, an entire secret city materialized almost overnight, home to enormous industrial facilities dedicated to separating and enriching uranium. At Hanford, in the remote high desert of Washington state, equally massive facilities produced plutonium, an artificial element that did not occur naturally on Earth in any meaningful quantity. And at Los Alamos, a remote, hastily constructed laboratory perched on a mesa in the New Mexico desert, Oppenheimer assembled a genuinely extraordinary concentration of scientific talent, many of them refugees who had personally fled fascism in Europe, working together under extreme secrecy and mounting pressure to solve the immense theoretical and engineering challenges standing between the physics of nuclear fission and an actual, deployable weapon. By the summer of 1945, after roughly 3 years of effort and an eventual cost equivalent to tens of billions of dollars in today's currency, the Manhattan Project had produced a small number of working atomic weapons. And on July 16, 1945, in the pre-dawn darkness of the New Mexico desert, the project's scientists gathered at a remote site to test one of them, a plutonium-based device, in an operation code-named Trinity. Observers stationed miles away, wearing specially darkened glasses, watched a light brighter than anything most of them had ever witnessed erupt over the desert floor, followed by a shockwave and a rising column of superheated air and debris that would come to define the iconic mushroom cloud image forever associated with nuclear weapons. Oppenheimer himself later recalled that the test brought to mind a line from the Bhagavad Gita, the ancient Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," a moment of genuine philosophical reckoning among scientists who understood, watching that fireball rise over the desert, that they had just crossed a threshold humanity could never uncross. The Trinity test succeeded at almost exactly the moment the political landscape surrounding its use was undergoing its own dramatic shift. President Roosevelt had died suddenly in April 1945, just months before the test, leaving Vice President Harry Truman, who had not even been informed of the Manhattan Project's existence until after taking office, to inherit the decision of whether and how to actually use the weapon his predecessor's administration had spent 3 years and enormous national resources building. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had already ended with Germany's surrender in May, meaning the original justification driving the bomb's development, the fear of a Nazi nuclear weapon, no longer applied at all. The war against Japan, however, continued with brutal intensity across the Pacific, and American military planners were deep into preparations for a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation that internal projections estimated could cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, and almost certainly far more Japanese military and civilian deaths. Given the ferocious resistance American forces had already encountered on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders and, in some cases, civilians had fought and died in numbers that suggested the invasion of the home islands themselves would be catastrophically bloody for everyone involved. Not every scientist who had helped build the bomb believed it should actually be used against Japanese cities. Leo Szilard circulated a petition among Manhattan Project scientists in the summer of 1945 urging President Truman to demonstrate the weapon's power in an uninhabited location first, or to at least give Japan clear, explicit warning before any use against a populated city. Arguments grounded in both moral concern about civilian casualties and strategic worry about what deploying this weapon might mean for the post-war world and an emerging rivalry with the Soviet Union. That petition never reached Truman before the final decision was made, and historians have continued debating for 80 years afterward whether the bombing of Japanese cities was militarily necessary to end the war without a costly invasion, whether a demonstration or additional warning might have achieved surrender without mass civilian casualties, and how much the timing of the decision was shaped by a desire to end the war before the Soviet Union could enter the Pacific conflict and claim a larger role in occupying post-war Japan. These questions remain genuinely, seriously contested among historians today, without a single settled consensus answer, and any honest account of this history has to acknowledge that the decision Truman made was neither an obvious, uncomplicated necessity nor a simple, uncontested atrocity, but a choice made under conditions of enormous pressure, incomplete information, and competing moral and strategic considerations that reasonable, informed people continue to weigh differently even today. What is not contested is what happened next. A target committee had already narrowed the list of potential Japanese cities based on factors including military and industrial significance, and, troublingly, the desire to select cities that had not already been heavily damaged by earlier conventional bombing campaigns, specifically so that the atomic bomb's unique destructive power could be clearly and unambiguously assessed and demonstrated. Hiroshima, a city serving as a significant military headquarters and industrial center, was selected as the primary target. On the morning of August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets and named after his mother, took off from the island of Tinian in the Pacific carrying a single uranium-based bomb that the crew had nicknamed Little Boy. At 8:15 local time, the bomb was released from over 30,000 feet, and after falling for approximately 43 seconds, detonated roughly 2,000 feet above the city, close enough to the ground to maximize the blast's devastating effect while still high enough to spread that destruction across the widest possible area. The destruction that followed unfolded on a scale that witnesses, even trained military observers watching from the departing aircraft, struggled to describe in any language adequate to what they were seeing. Within a radius of roughly 1 mile from the point of detonation, the blast and accompanying heat, reaching temperatures compared to the surface of the sun in the immediate vicinity of the explosion, killed the overwhelming majority of people instantly or within moments, incinerating buildings, vaporizing some victims so completely that only shadow-like silhouettes remained burned into stone surfaces where they had been standing. Tens of thousands more suffered horrific burns and injuries from the blast wave and the firestorm that swept through the wooden buildings making up much of the city in the hours that followed, while survivors further from the epicenter, spared instant death, would in the weeks and months ahead begin succumbing to radiation sickness, an entirely new category of mass casualty that doctors on the ground, unfamiliar with anything resembling this kind of injury, initially struggled even to understand or treat. Historians' estimates of the total death toll from Hiroshima vary considerably depending on the time frame considered and the methodology used, but consistently range from roughly 70,000 to well over 140,000 people by the end of 1945 alone, a figure that continued climbing in the years that followed as survivors, known in Japan as hibakusha, developed cancers and other long-term illnesses directly attributable to their radiation exposure, some dying years or even decades after the bombing itself. Japan's government, still absorbing the scale of what had happened at Hiroshima and struggling to fully comprehend a weapon unlike anything in human history, did not immediately surrender. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union, honoring a commitment made at the Yalta Conference earlier that year, declared war on Japan and launched a massive military offensive against Japanese forces in Manchuria, opening an entirely new front in the war at almost exactly the moment a second American bomber, carrying a plutonium-based weapon nicknamed Fat Man, approached the Japanese city of Kokura, the intended primary target that day. Cloud cover obscuring Kokura forced the crew to divert to their secondary target, the city of Nagasaki, where the bomb detonated that same morning, killing tens of thousands more people in an act of destruction that, layered directly on top of the Soviet declaration of war just hours earlier, presented Japan's leadership with an overwhelming, simultaneous collapse of both their military position and their last remaining diplomatic hope that the Soviet Union might help broker a negotiated peace, rather than joining the war against them. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people directly by radio, an unprecedented act in itself, announcing Japan's surrender and formally bringing the Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, to its conclusion. The war that had begun in 1939 and that had already claimed tens of millions of lives across multiple continents through combat, genocide, starvation, and disease, ended within days of a single new weapons introduction, a fact that has shaped how the atomic bomb has been remembered and discussed ever since, celebrated by some as the decisive action that spared the world an even bloodier invasion, and mourned by others as an act of civilian destruction on a scale that crossed a moral line humanity could never fully walk back from. Both of those readings sit inside the historical record simultaneously, neither one erasing the other, and that unresolved tension is, in many ways, the defining legacy the atomic bomb left behind, not just for Japan, but for the entire structure of global power that emerged in the decades that followed. That legacy took shape almost immediately. The United States held a monopoly on nuclear weapons for barely 4 years before the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb in August 1949, an achievement accelerated significantly by Soviet espionage that had successfully penetrated the Manhattan Project itself, obtaining technical information that shaved years off what Soviet scientists would otherwise have needed to develop independently. That successful Soviet test shattered any illusion that nuclear weapons might remain under the control of a single nation, and triggered what would become one of the defining features of the following 4.5 decades of global politics. An escalating nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union that would eventually produce weapons thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, including the hydrogen bomb, first tested by the United States in 1952, and by the Soviet Union shortly afterward, a thermonuclear weapon that used the atomic bomb's fission reaction merely as a trigger for a far more powerful fusion reaction, the same basic physical process that powers the sun itself. This new reality reshaped global politics into a structure built around a genuinely unprecedented concept: mutually assured destruction. The grim strategic logic that as long as two rival nuclear powers each possessed the capacity to devastate the other beyond recovery, neither could rationally strike first without guaranteeing its own annihilation and the resulting retaliation. That precarious balance held, often by frighteningly thin margins, through decades of Cold War crises. Most dramatically during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, when the United States and Soviet Union came closer to actual nuclear conflict than at any other point in the entire Cold War. A 13-day standoff resolved through tense diplomacy that many historians and participants alike have since described as a moment the world came within a hair's breadth of catastrophe. The sheer terror generated by this new strategic reality eventually pushed even bitter Cold War rivals toward cooperation on containing the danger they had created, producing agreements including the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, which sought, with only partial success, to limit the further spread of nuclear weapons to additional countries beyond the handful that had already developed them. Nuclear technology's story did not remain confined entirely to weapons, however, and the same fission reaction that powered the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki also became the foundation for civilian nuclear power generation, which today supplies a meaningful share of electricity across dozens of countries worldwide, offering a low-carbon energy source that has become an increasingly significant part of global conversations about climate change and energy policy, even as the same underlying physics that makes it possible also means that the risks of catastrophic accident, demonstrated by disasters at Chernobyl in 1986 and Fukushima in 2011, remain permanently embedded in that technology's promise. Medical applications of nuclear physics have quietly transformed modern healthcare in ways most patients never connect back to Hiroshima at all. From radiation therapy used to treat cancer, to diagnostic imaging techniques that rely on radioactive isotopes to reveal what is happening inside the human body without invasive surgery. An entire branch of modern medicine built on the same fundamental discovery that Otto Hahn, Lise Meitner, and their colleagues stumbled into in a Berlin laboratory in 1938. Today, roughly 80 years after that single morning over Hiroshima, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons, collectively holding arsenals numbering in the thousands, a fraction of the tens of thousands stockpiled at the height of the Cold War, but still more than sufficient to reshape the planet's climate and civilization should they ever be used at scale. The city of Hiroshima itself has been rebuilt, its population today larger than it was on the morning the bomb fell. Home to a peace memorial park and museum built specifically to ensure that what happened there is never allowed to fade into abstraction. A place where the physical remnants of that morning, twisted steel, scorched stone, the skeletal dome of a building that somehow remained partially standing near the blast's epicenter, still stand as a deliberate, permanent reminder of what human ingenuity proved capable of releasing the moment it finally understood the true structure of the atom. That is the one unforgettable shift worth carrying with you long after this story ends. The same species that spent 25 centuries slowly working out, through pure philosophical curiosity and painstaking experimental science, what an atom actually was, took less than 4 decades to turn that understanding into a weapon capable of erasing a city in the time it takes to draw a single breath, and less than 4 years after that to build enough of those weapons, on both sides of an emerging global rivalry, to threaten the survival of civilization itself. Every time electricity from a nuclear power plant reaches a home, every time a cancer patient receives radiation therapy, every time a diplomatic crisis anywhere in the world triggers headlines about nuclear tension between rival nations, all of it traces directly back to that single flash of light over Hiroshima on an ordinary Monday morning in August 1945, and further back still, to a Greek philosopher who once wondered, purely as a matter of abstract reasoning, whether matter could be divided forever, or whether somewhere, eventually, you would hit something that could not be broken any further. He could never have imagined what waited on the other side of that answer.